Hi, good afternoon. I know we are between you and the next coffee break, so we'll keep it short and sweet.
I talk really fast, so.
But it's been a great 1 year for us, Heather, working with you, especially with your varied background from semiconductors to software to really having Hitachi focus on outcome-based offerings, sufferings.
Sometimes.
It's sometimes, as you'll see as we go through, but just looking at the customer centricity that you're bringing, and then, believe it or not, guys, the kick-ass execution skills you bring to the table really helped us along that journey.
And so Deepak has been my partner in crime as we've gone through the whole Hitachi transformation over the last year. His background also somewhat in semiconductor as well as software has kept us honest on where we're getting into our own way, and we're making some of those bad choices about where we want to be versus things that we're doing today. He's really bad at sports analogies, so don't ever get into a conversation about American sports with him. He'll fail you miserably, but other than that, it's been a good experience.
I do now know that Padres is a baseball team. So. But coming back to the matter at hand, what we wanted to do today was really focus on 5 key things, talk a little bit about the business model shifts that are kind of the key driver for some of the elements around CX and customer success, and then talk through how we established the vision, what was the elements around the surround model. We'll talk a little bit about that, and then really hone in on the design points that were critical and our learnings along the way. And we are hoping that that will help generate more conversation and give some insights for all of you out here. So without further ado, I'll jump into it. I think this is like a key thing and the key change that's happened. It's simple, but most organizations are still struggling with it. So there was a time in B2B when it was all about, I have a product, I have a data sheet, selling speeds and feeds. That business has changed. It's no longer about a product, to whom can I sell, but it's actually beginning at the other end of the spectrum. You begin with your customers and you start thinking, how can I help? How do I make sure they're getting the maximum value from whatever outcomes they are trying to drive, and how do I put my capabilities together in order to give them an offering that will take them in that direction. So it really requires a mind shift, not just a skill shift, to start thinking from a customer lens, to start thinking about the business outcome first, and then translate it back. And that, I think, is something that companies are still struggling with. It sounds like a simple concept, but when you get down into the process systems and everything that have been established over the last several decades, that's just not how organizations tend to think. They're still more inside out from that perspective.
So our experience was actually around X as a service and IoT as we make the shift into IoT. And it was incredibly hard as we got involved in these very high-touch, very dynamic customer engagement models for us to get things done, right? So there was confusion as to what was sold versus what the customer expected versus what we thought we were delivering. So we were missing that part of that DNA. And when we try to get changes made, it took so much effort just to get it done. So feeding back into the product organization, feeding back into the services organization. And we had this giant epiphany. This dynamic customer engagement model, we just, as a product company, we're not set up to manage it, right? We're used to 12, 24-month roadmaps. You know, you set your speeds and feeds well in advance and you deliver to that. And we'd entered into a world where we needed to iterate much more quickly. So that's kind of where we took this big step back from and went, okay, so what do we need to do to kind of change this to be successful? Because having 50 people to deliver on this, $10 million contract just wasn't going to cut the mustard for the long term. So we aligned within our customer success model, which we really believed was the DNA that we needed to start to develop to be successful in this world, on 3 key things, right? So customer success, first and foremost, it needed to drive seamless coordination, right? So what was sold versus what a customer thought they bought versus what it was we were delivering. They needed to be the connective tissue in answering that question, right? So they were the person above that was holding everybody honest. They also needed to line everybody on a unified set of outcomes, right? So that we weren't having those post-contract discussions around what was sold, what was contracted, and what we thought I need to do. They owned that. They were accountable. They sat above everybody else to hold everyone accountable for what that was. And then they also owned the value prop, and not just for that one solution, but for the overall relationship with Hitachi in general. So they owned the value plan as it related to that customer. And those were kind of the 3 key tenets. Those were our North Star as we went through designing this.
And that's really critical in putting in the larger scheme of things, right? So we called it like the customer surround model. But the idea was that not only do you need it to be frictionless, that I'm sure all of us have heard by now, but also needed to be seamless between the physical and digital elements. So when you think of the broader customer experience, you're starting to rethink the human elements in terms of it's an ecosystem. I need to orchestrate it. I need to be more consultative. It's not about selling. It's about helping your customer figure out the outcomes they want, and really co-creating sometimes the solution with them. At the same time, the way you get scale for that is by enabling the digital ecosystem that sits underneath it, right? So how do I make sure it's personalized, it's contextualized, it's real time, it's automated, putting all those elements together. And then within that surround model is where your CX and CSM needs to sit in more clearly.
So for us, we're a company that a function applies to a person, right? We have developers, we have salespeople, we have service delivery people. So the concept of customer success as a function was something that we needed to wrap our brains around. So, and it speaks actually directly to what Deepak is saying. So there is a CSM, there is a high-touch human element of it, but there's also an equally important digital element of this, right? So how does that work? And when we were looking at our ecosystem and what we needed to develop and what we needed to design for, they needed to use those with equal weight. So we took our three things, which I touched on earlier, and we said this is going to inform, go ahead, how it is we build the customer success touch points across the entire customer value chain. So first and foremost, we needed a closed loop feedback, right? So kind of to that 12 to 24 month development DNA, we had to break it down, right? We needed to be able to open a direct line into product, services, or wherever in order to change whatever it was that we were doing in alignment with that customer expectation, right? We were sitting at these conversations with our customers, understanding their business. We've got this valuable seat at the table, understanding what they're trying to drive within their business world, and yet we're still looking at it from a technology and a product-centric world. So that was one thing. The next thing, and this is actually was born out of a conversation with a bunch of our kind of lead sales reps and some of our sales leaders, that low-touch digital element is every bit as important as that high-touch, pick your strategic customers and really build a solid relationship with them. They were looking at their ability to kind of farm additional opportunities with that is actually almost greater than those high-touch customer environments. And that was that was an epiphany for myself. So when we look at what we prioritize next, it's kind of those things are unequal. And then the next piece of it was to ensure that we actually tied everything together, kind of back to that cohesive customer engagement model so that the customers had a great experience for us.
That's an excellent point. And then the question is, how do you bring all this together? And how do you make sure that it's something not only can you measure, but also scale it as you need? And let me just take a quick minute to kind of explain the framework you're seeing, and then we'll talk in detail about it. But the idea for customer success was you look at it from two lenses, an outside in and an inside out. The outside in lens was focused on two things. Number one, business value. Did the customer actually get the value that was sold to them, whatever the business case may have been for that particular offering? And then the second thing was, while they were getting that value, how was their experience in engaging with you, good, bad, or ugly? And then there was the inside out, which is the performance value. In the old world, you can just think of it as, did the product meet the data sheet specs, right? Did it perform what it said it was going to do? When you get all these three elements right, and each company kind of has to think through what are the right metrics that go into creating this, and you do the data analytics, you'll get 4 outcomes for yourself that you can very quickly correlate. Number 1, your customers will pay more. Number 2, they'll stay longer. Number 3, they'll actually be cheaper to serve than your other customers. And number 4, they'll turn into brand advocates. So if you put this whole system together, you can start off on a slightly manual journey. But in reality, once you get this going, you can easily slice and dice the scorecard, and you can tweak it to match your DNA. You can take it all the way up to account level, all the way down to account level, all the way up to region, segments, by product. So you can slice and dice and get different kind of insights back to really see what's happening where and where you need to go focus in order to increase that value maximization. And the beauty of this is that once you focus on value maximization, the other things are just byproducts. The fact that they pay more, the fact that they stay longer is a byproduct of actually fixing what is really needed to be fixed. And so that's kind of how we design the scorecard, and you use this framework to leverage for yourself.
So when we took the scorecard for Hitachi, we actually had to, tailor it for our DNA. And one of the things that we took off the table as a lower priority, if you're going to force rank the stuff, is the performance sector, right? We really wanted to focus on the customer experience and the customer value. And that was about, A, making sure that we were landing and expanding our existing product sets the way that we needed to, and that they were consumable. And then the other pieces of that were understanding those products. I mean, I'm sure you guys have all heard about that. They talk about the consumption gap. So how do we understand the value that those products are driving in those customers, and how is that value being consumed? So those were two of our major focuses as we roll out customer success at Hitachi. The performance piece we think will grow over time, but we really felt we needed to get our arms wrapped around the other two first.
And speaking of customer experience and value, just let me relate a quick story to contextualize this for all of us. We were working with another company where their chief customer officer was visiting a major client where they had delivered the business case or business value 3 months in advance. So instead of 12 months, they had delivered it in 9 months, and everybody was high-fiving, everybody is happy, this has got to be the best customer. He sits down next to the VP at the customer site, and the first thing the VP says is, I want to thank you for your team. They delivered 3 months in advance, but the experience was so horrible. If I could switch, I would switch tomorrow. So that kind of tells you, like, keeping that balance between business value and experience is really critical. It was like the bulb went off for that chief customer officer, and he was like, I got to be able to measure this properly. It's not about tilting one way too much versus the other, but actually having that balance and understanding that you are doing it the right way versus over tilting on one side and declaring victory at that point.
So our aha moments along the way, I've touched on some of them. So know your North Star. A lot of people come to the table when you're designing this function. A lot of people with strong opinions that are probably very customer-centric. They think that customer centricity is about giving the customer whatever it is they want. But we needed everyone to align that customer success was about a much more holistic view than that. So that was the number one. That was our first thing. Be clear on that purpose. It's a follow-on, right? It's not about necessarily making the customer feel like they won every battle. It's making them realize that in all of the battles, they're further ahead than they would be winning that one. Involve functions early. We learned early on that getting people on board with what our vision was and what we were trying to do was something that we could have done even earlier, right? So obviously, when you talk about customer success as a farmer position versus sales, there's potentially some overlap in there. So in order to get sales on board, and frankly, when you get them on board, they are the best advocates in the whole wide world, was something that we could have done earlier in the process. Mind and skill shift. For us, we need to make sure that our dashboard is aligning with actually viewing those things, right? So this is a big shift for Hitachi. So we know that that's something that we've got to keep our eye on, and it's something you're looking at every single month. And then talk to peers. So do what it is we're doing here. Talk to different companies who have a different view. And in my opinion, I mean, kind of if you look at the different ways that you can slice and dice customer success, there is no one perfect model. And I think that you get the best outcome in talking with peers and what it is they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, talking to peers is definitely something worthwhile. I mean, I still remember the scorecard you guys just saw, when we were designing that with the team, it was a big challenge, and we were like churning on it for a while. And then we set up a 40-minute peer-to-peer session with another company who had designed the scorecard, and the design was done. So we accomplished something in 40 minutes that we had been struggling for like 2.5 weeks. So that definitely works a lot, because sometimes it's a new concept for people to get their head around. And if they hear from a peer who's done it and who talks about their own journey, it just kind of clicks for them. The involving functions early, I cannot stress that more. I mean, the amount of pain we went through as we tried to get the other functions on board was really, really challenging.
But it's hard because you don't want anyone to call your baby ugly. Right? I mean, and you're worried that people aren't going to get it. So you feel like you've got to get this model perfect before you start sharing it. Don't make that mistake.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think involving people upfront and making sure they understand really eliminates like the egos, the threats people feel that, oh my God, what is this function going to do? I can't lose my account. All of those things that come, which are kind of irrational fears, kind of dissolve away if you do the right thinking upfront on it, for sure.
And this is the obligatory have fun slide. So in a company the size of Hitachi, it is very rare that you get an opportunity to set up a net new function, right? From the ground floor up. So that experience, although tough, has been a really, really fun one, right? So you're joining organizations that haven't necessarily always worked together cooperatively. So there's a lot of good, there's a lot of good humor that comes out of that. There's a lot of good fights, so it's kind of all in the family. Celebrate your wins. That's why knowing where you're going and setting small kind of iterative changes as you go and wins that you get is really important to do, because so much of this work can be really, really difficult. I mean, you've seen it. It's gone from weeks of work to a couple of hours until somebody new comes in, and then we all get to make fun of them and bring them on board. It's actually.
This whole thing that you see was a 2-day workshop rolled into one sheet of things. But really the idea is like enjoy, celebrate the small victories, make sure people are involved. I think that really accelerates the design, because in the end, if the DNA doesn't change, you can put the best process systems in place. It's not going to change the culture. You have to change the thinking. You have to change the conversation at all levels of the organization for customer success to truly start getting infused and change what they do out in the field. With that, I think we are just on time
Right on
for your
time.
coffee break.
Thanks you guys very much for your time.